Okay, I think we're going to start. First of all, welcome to everyone who's here. We will be it'll be a little bit of disruption, but we're fine with people coming in for a bit. But that's all right, don't worry about it. We're just going to kick off. I am Singh. I am Professor for Creative Writing and Inclusion in the Arts here at London Metropolitan University. I work a lot around armed conflict, but specifically around the role of women and children in situations of armed conflict. I've got a book coming out which is fiction, but it covers 100 years of war, so starting with First World War down to now, and focuses primarily on women and children who are caught in that situation across about 12 countries and quite a few conflicts, I think about 12 conflicts as well. I'm really, really delighted to host the seminar for Global Diversities and Inequalities Research Center. We're going to keep that sign there. And so first of all, welcome. I am particularly delighted to have our speakers today. I am a huge fan of their work, so that's always particularly lovely to have people that you really admire and are fond of. So I will introduce both our speakers, after which I will ask them to talk a little bit about their work, their most recent work, and we will then open it up. We will have a little bit of a discussion around the theme, and we will open it up to questions, because I think this is an area that we should be talking about a lot more than we do. Now, I know that the event description was titled Women and Violence, and there was a reason for that, because we want to talk about women not only as victims of violence, especially in war situations, but as combatants and perpetrators of violence as well. It's a very complex role that women occupy. One of the statistics that Nimmi will talk about 30% of combatants in active non-state violent movements are women. There are a lot of other women who are involved in non-combatant roles in organizations as well. So I think it's something that we should be talking about. So I'm going to start with introducing both of our speakers. First of all, Dr. Nimmi Gowrinathan. She is an activist, a writer and scholar, and founder of Politics of Sexual Violence Initiative, where she directs Beyond Identity, a gendered platform for scholars, activists at the City College of New York. The publisher of Adi magazine and the creator of Female Fighter series at the Guernica magazine. Nimmi's forthcoming book, Radicalizing Her, Beacon Press, or actually I suppose it's out already, isn't it? Yeah. Examines the politics of the female fighter. Her political essays have appeared in Harper's Magazine, Freeman's Journal, Guernica Magazine, and Foreign Affairs, amongst others. And our second speaker is Meena Kandasamy. She's an anti-caste activist, poet, novelist, and translator. Her writing aims to deconstruct trauma and violence while spotlighting the militant resistance against caste, gender, and ethnic oppressions. She explores this in her poetry and prose, most notably in her book of poems, such as Touch, 2006, Miss Militancy, 2010, as well as the three novels, The Gypsy Goddess, 2014, When I Hit You, 2017, and Exquisite Cadavers, 2019. Her latest work, and the one she's going to hopefully be talking to us about, is a collection of essays, The Orders Were to Rape You, Tamil Tigresses in the Elam Struggle, 2021. Her novels have been shortlisted for Women's Prize for Fiction, the International Dylan Thomas Prize, the Jalak Prize, and the Hindu Lit Prize. Activism is at the heart of her literary work. She has translated several political texts from Tamil to English and previously held an editorial role at the Dalit, an alternative magazine. Meena also holds a PhD in sociolinguistics, and her op-eds and essays have appeared in the White Review, Guernica, The Guardian, New York Times, and other places. Now, I quickly want to talk a little bit about both the books, and just to get you a sense of what to expect. Radicalizing Her, Why Women Choose Violence, asks what those in power, those with power in the West, typically do not see, and the questions they do not ask when they see women militants. Although the female fighter is often seen as an anomaly, women make up nearly 30% of militant movements worldwide. Historically, these women viewed as victims, weak-willed wives. Sorry, one of the issues around not having English as your first language, I can't do W and V in a row, and prey to Stockholm Syndrome. These beliefs have been deeply held, but also misunderstood. Radicalizing her holds the female fighter up in all her complexity as a kind of mirror to contemporary conversations on gender, violence, and power. With narratives anchored in battlefields in the global south, Gowrinathan offers critical insights at a moment that demands an urgent reimagining of the possibilities for women to resist on American streets. I'm going to now quickly talk about Meena's book, The Orders Were to Rape You, Tigresses in the Tamil Elam Struggle. In 2009, the genocidal war of the Sri Lankan state against Tamils ends. In 2012, Meena Kandasamy, who grew up with the poster-sized pictures of Tamil tigers and tigresses, decides to make a documentary on the violence faced by female fighters of the liberation tigers of Tamil Elam in the aftermath of the brutal war. She meets the women who had survived the Sri Lankan camps where the orders were to rape them. Women who are now refugees in distant lands, pale shadows of their blazing selves. Her documentary never gets made, but Kandasamy exhumes old hard drives to piece together their shattered lives. The book also holds poetry that Meena Kandasamy translates and presents from 3 Tamil women combatants. This is poetry as op-ed, poetry as resistance, poetry as a call to arms, and poetry as a call to poetry. I'm going to invite Nimmi first to join us and talk a little bit about your book. And then I have questions, I have a lot of questions, so we will continue from there.
Thank you so much, Sunny. Thank you all for being here today. I think first what's interesting is the statistic, 30% militant women, because it's been the same since I started this research 20 years ago. And it's used for every militant movement everywhere, which sort of tells you really how much research has been done about these women, because it's very unlikely that it's 30% everywhere now. For me, this was sort of this is a project connected to my own identity, my own shift in political consciousness over time. It happened that I was working in an orphanage in Sri Lanka in the northeast during the interlude, the peace, when the Tigers controlled territory, which was 2001. And a lot of these young women, I was doing kind of a volunteerist, identity-seeking mission at that time, but a lot of these young women had come from the Tigers, or their relatives were in the Tigers, or their sisters were in the Tigers. And at the same time, I was doing a PhD at UCLA, and I was doing a PhD in political science, right? And we were studying ethnic federalism and revolution and all these big questions, right? And in the summers, I would go back and work with these women in different ways over time. And eventually, what was happening in the classroom and what was happening in these spaces started to sort of come up against each other, no? Because we were reading these texts that essentially were, even if they said people, they could be read as why men rebel, right? But I was sitting with all of these women who had clearly rebelled or were part of a movement, right? And it wasn't really like, I want to introduce women and include women in something. It was that if we view the conflict through their grievances, through their decisions to join, we actually reveal a different set of political motivations, right? And we understand the conflict differently, right? It wasn't a simple sort of like inclusion. And so, my PhD advisors, as they're up to do, sort of saw that as my activism. This is her activism. And, she'll study something big like ethnic federalism. And eventually I fought to have this dissertation passed. And at that time, by the time it finished, I had gone through all these different spaces, and I had a career that had followed the lives of the Tamil women that I met, right? So there was a tsunami, and I became this accidental aid worker, right? The war started again, and I was an advocate meeting with Samantha Powers and meeting with Barack Obama, and the war ended in this horrible sort of mass atrocity and genocide, and I became a human rights worker, documenting the mass rapes that had happened to these women. And for me, at the end of all that time of 15 years of working with Tamil women, it felt like a failure of sorts, right? When 2009 happened, my option was to get a job in the academy, which had treated me quite badly throughout, and it didn't seem to accept this as real work, or to be the head of an NGO, which had turned their backs on the Tamils in the final days of the war, right? And that moment sort of forced, I think, a lot of us. 2009 was a sort of crystallizing moment for a lot of Tamils about where we stood, whether we would appeal to international forces, whether we would, and all of that came crashing down, this revolution we believed in. And I realized that a lot of the failure, not to say that I was going to save the Tamil women independently, right, but that I had operated at a very high level, and Tamil women were worse off than they were ever, And that failure to me, if I looked back across those years, was that none of these spaces were able to grapple with her politics. None of them saw her as a political actor, right? Because she had a politics they didn't agree with. If she was democratic and peaceful and she, then fine. But she chose violence, and so she was suddenly left out of everything, right? And I think that this book, it was more important to me to write a mainstream book than an academic book, to be able to sort of excavate that a little bit. Why is it that we can't see this woman? Why is it so difficult for us in so many fields to accept this woman who chooses violence? So I'll read a short excerpt from the book. It is inside the overlapping circles of the moral righteousness of nonviolence and the entrenched beliefs on the inherent nature of women that the female fighter and her motivations are disappeared. If nonviolence is valorized as the only legitimate form of resistance, women are the presumed peaceful moral core that holds this argument in place. And then I think, of course, as Sunny was mentioning earlier, when you say women in violence, the assumption is that you're talking about rape always, right? Because we get used to this kind of trauma-based mobilizing. And particularly with female fighters, the first thing that would be dismissed was her brain. No, she was brainwashed, obviously. She couldn't have joined on her own. Or she joined because of a man around her, husband, her brother, somebody else, right? She was this untethered, apolitical being who could just, some of the analysts on ISIS, where she was drawn to Tumblr by bright colors and pastels, right? Rather than seeing that there was a kind of analysis there, right? And there's one more quote I'll read. To consider the decision to choose violence as a momentary lapse of rationality is to dismiss the expansive reservoirs of trauma that shape the makeup of the women who do. For the women I have known, political consciousness would form slowly as they move through multiple emotional states to their own political territories. When the violations of the state are intimate, the injury to soft spaces hardens quickly. The female fighter is enraged. Her political identity is shaped by the experiences of state violence. She is not defined solely by her trauma. Violence was the only means of political resistance, and she does not seek individual empowerment, rather the collective liberation from multiple sources of repression. So, of course, there's a lot in the book. It's a very dense book. So I'll have to talk about it, in more detail.
Okay, Meena, we've talked about both our works, and this is a strange territory because there are three people here who work, at least two of us work back and forth between creative and academic, or non-fiction and fictional, and poetry as various forms of responses. So does Nimmi. So I think it's a really interesting one to think about as we go forward, how we are all responding to, as not just activists or academics or theorists, but also as creative practitioners. Meena, I wanted to talk to you about this particular book because I wrote I wrote a story about a Tamil tigress back in 2000, just before the genocide, in fact, started. And I was kind of like you, fascinated by that figure. But I was also watching the ways in which they were, the women specifically, were almost erased out of the narrative quite quickly as political actors, and it became, and I think for me there was an overlap with the endless war on terror, especially as it kicks off with the invasion of Iraq and then Afghanistan, and the concurrent Islamophobia that goes alongside it. Now, you've been talking to Tamil tigresses. I know that this has been a long-standing project of yours. So tell us how you get to this particular book.
Thanks a lot, and thanks a lot to Professor Sunny and also to Dr. Nimmi here. These are two phenomenal women, because the kind of writing that I do in many ways would not exist for the kind of, trailblazing, or what you call breaking down many barriers that both of them have done in terms of their own work, just to open up opportunities, but also give you these spaces or ideas, or academic frameworks within which you try to write what you write about. Because my engagement with the female fighters was unlike a research project, and unlike something that I came into as an adult, was something I witnessed as a kid. So, and like India has this huge north-south divide, but we were living in Tamil Nadu. And in Tamil Nadu, the late 80s, I was someone born in 84, the late 80s was a period which saw a remarkable influx in the number of refugees. And Tamil people welcomed them into their homes. So just as there was enormous political support in the rest of Tamil Nadu, there was widespread, massive, mass support among the people, because I think this was for two reasons. Of course, there's the language, language commonality, which united us, they are Tamil, we are Tamil. But I think more than that, what really, made Indian Tamil people, in a sense, complicit, but in a sense, very supportive of the Tigers, but also, many other militant movements that existed there, was the violence that the Indian army was perpetrating. So, at some point, for a long time, it had been the Sinhalese oppressing, the Sinhalese army on the Tamil women or Tamil population in general. At some point, India decided to intervene. And like so the first thing is, it said Operation Poomalai, which was like Operation Garlands. And then it was like, India said, we are going to, actually challenge the sovereignty of Sri Lanka. We are going to drop food to Tamil people if you're going to block them from getting food. So they said all these right things. And then when they went inside, the character, the character of the intervention changed. So this army, which went there to, so-called quote-unquote keep peace, became a rapist army, became an occupying army, became an army that did. So in some ways, we felt very complicit that it was our army which was doing this to, quote-unquote, our brothers and sisters, because we share the same language. And I think that, the kind of stories that would come out of Jaffna, but also come on Indian television, but also everywhere, was what was happening to the women. And for ages this used to be, and I think it actually culminated in 1991 when Rajiv Gandhi was assassinated, which I think was a blunder. Everybody thinks was a blunder. But at that point, a female suicide bomber, why did she do that? And people's idea was, why were women doing this? Why did women have to become suicide bombers? What did the Indian army do? Like, they could have been targeting only Sri Lankan leaders, right? So Sinhalese leaders. So why did they have to target an Indian head of state? Because the Indian army was, responsible. And in what ways the Indian army was just. So the whole idea of, rape as something that was, perpetrated on Tamil women, but also India's own complicity in all of this, if they were training the tigers, and then they were fighting the tigers. They were asking for peace, but they were supplying weapons. So there was absolute double speak. And as Tamil people, we are Indian citizens, but Tamil speakers, this was like, you are either a traitor either way, like whichever you choose to be. And I think that this was something I wanted to unpack, like, to understand and to go further. So I think at that point, like after the 1991 assassination, ground support completely with that. Every pocket of support was underground. And especially after 9/11, it became like global terrorist organizations, so the support became even more difficult to do. But still there was, the political narrative never shifted. The politically, any party that came to power was still supportive of self-determination. So, we were like, 60 million people, but we went and completely, every election, this used to be an issue and people were supporting. So for me, growing up or, witnessing all of this unfold, at some point you realize that 9/11 happens, the war on terror, this entire imperialist speech or code switching happens. And at that point in time, you realize that, this is how they're going to bring an end to it. And that's how 2009 plays out. But also, you realize that, women who were valorized in some senses, when the rest of the world were seeing them as brainwashed, like Nim was saying, you can't be a fighter, the tigers possibly kidnapped them, brainwashed them, used them. But they were like, seen in a sense as like almost leading the struggle. So there was a very different construction of the female fighter. So it became very common for people to call their children Malati, for instance, in Tamil Nadu. For writers to choose the name Malati, she was the first Tamil suicide bomber. So, they became like, names you give your children, and that doesn't happen easily. It doesn't happen because, somebody gives you money. You don't name your children for money. You name your children because you identify with something. So the way they, like people would call them children, Angair, Kanne. So all of the names of Tamil tigresses started infiltrating into Tamil people's names. So they started meaning a cultural thing. Like, even though we were never involved in the conflict. And 2009, it was a very brutal end to Tamil people in general, not just to the tigers. But then, I started hearing these reports about what was happening, like in the camps. So these women were, taken to these camps, rehabilitation camps, so, even camps for civilians, and they were getting raped. So this became like an urgent story to say. So, at some point, these women were so inspirational to you and to, fighting power to everybody, like, they kind of changing the history of the subcontinent. And then you see that they are like completely powerless and without. So it's also, I think, a question of, you earlier spoke about means of dissemination of information. We write short stories, Nim writes articles, but she also does a lot of talking. So we try to, she runs a magazine. So we have, but the thing is, the Tamil nationalist movement had a lot of sources of dissemination of information. So they ran their own websites. They had the Voice of Tigers radio. They had their own television channels, including one of their famous anchors who was, killed, Isai Priya. So they, because it was a very strong movement, which not only had its own police stations, had its own courts, and which was recognized by, the Norway, the agreement for, interim self-governance. So they were like a de facto state. But as a state, or as a, militant state, they had all of these arms of, like methods of mobilization, but also propaganda. Like they could put out magazines, books, everything for people to know what their struggle was about. But then the war happened, and then these women were reduced to speechlessness. And the only speech they were allowed was through these processes of, applying for an asylum, applying as a refugee, or giving these testimonies in private. So I think at that moment I chose to write about it, and that's how the book happened. I think I have talked a lot.
No, I think we've got lots of ideas to throw around, and I think that's really important. I think for me, what is really interesting, specifically with the Tamil Tigers, but actually lots of militant movements across the global south, and how closely linked they are, and how you can trace them back in many ways, the grievances, the ongoing oppressions, but often sometimes the actual situations have been created by the empire. And at some point in this political process of independence, if you want to call it, or self-governance, the post-colonial state becomes the imperial state. So you have various supposed nation states with armies then working in this strange double-speak moment where some people are offered self-determination. Often, generally, it works across the border, not within the national border, and then they're working and implementing same mechanisms and methods as imperial governments had done before. So I think that's for me one of the more interesting areas, and how that shifts so clearly after 9/11. But I wonder how much you see that imperial method of silencing colonized women from the beginning as political actors, and how much that is taken up as a mechanism by whether it's India or Sri Lanka or any other post-colonial state.
So the question is if the ways in which the imperial state had learned to silence women in the colonies, whether that was replicated inside the descent, like Tamil women, if they were showing. I think a lot of this, and I know this can be controversial sometimes, but a lot of my struggle with talking about the female fighters when it comes up against white feminism. And I think that that can't be disconnected from the imperial project, no? And we have a paper that myself and some colleagues wrote that was called Emissaries of Empowerment, right? Because there was a point at which I had been doing this aid work, but at the same time, because of the tsunami, right? And I had been working with the female fighters. And here I was giving out chickens and cows and sewing machines to women who had been on battlefields, right? And then I went to Pakistan after the floods, and I went to Kashmir after the earthquake, and it was the same approach everywhere, right? And with my sort of co-authors, we kind of trace this language of empowerment. First, have its roots, of course, in the global South, as most things do that are originally revolutionary. And then it was taken up by the UN and others, right? And it was used to almost the exact same language was found by our colleague Rafia Zakaria in the English Woman's Journal, right? That these are special and deserving objects of our concern, right? So this language of empowerment that was tied to power that we were using everywhere at the UN. If you walked around the UN Women's Summit, what work do you do? We do empowerment. What does that mean? What does that mean? It doesn't mean anything, right? It could mean anything from giving a woman a chicken to, but never anything political, right? And so the way that I think about most of the women that I know in these places is that they exist under these concentric circles of captivity. And so you have like the husband, and you have often a difficult marriage, then you have the community, you have the society, and then you have the state, right? The state is the one she never gets to hold accountable. But the language that came through a kind of white feminist framework was she was free from one, then she was free from all of them, right? And that's never true, right? She's under these multiple sources. So imagine, particularly for the ex-combatants that I knew after the war, they were outside the community because they had been ex-combatants, so everybody was nervous to be around them, so they left the villages, right? Then they had been raped, so they were outside the society because they were bad luck and they couldn't go to marriages, they couldn't go to community functions, right? So they were outside of their, not just their physical village, but their community. They were already on the outside of a state because they were the minority who was oppressed. And then the NGO comes in and says, here's a chicken that's going to bring you all the way from there back here, right? If the word had been dismantled and people were forced to say, how are you shifting individual and collective political power with these billions of dollars that you're raising, right? That was sort of the point of what this report was doing, and the reaction to it, to me, was quite fascinating, because the reaction was, you're absolutely right, empowerment's not working. What's your solution? Except that the crux of the report was how this word was depoliticizing, how it was calculatedly stripping these women of their politics, right? So I don't have to have a solution for you. Your work is to sit with that. But the way it was jumped over, right? And so the reason that this came about and that kind of imperialist tie was because of like trying to present that absurdity, the juxtaposition of the female fighter who had been on the battlefield, being given a pastry cart because she can't walk because one of her legs has been blown off. So those, I think, became very effective methods for the state, absolutely, to shut down the voices of women. Of course, there were forces inside the community as well who didn't recognize the contributions of women, but the primary challenge, I think, was from the state, of course, and a lot of that, particularly in Sri Lanka, came through the work of the government being handed over to NGOs as soon as any NGO came in, particularly post-tsunami, just a massive influx of NGOs. And so that's primarily who these women were dealing with, right? And so their option, if a rebel movement comes along and says, well, we can give you an option to fight for political rights, or you can take that chicken and try and, do something with it. That, to me, really was where we saw that kind of imperial feminism, you know, deny these women any sort of agency, right? And not as a kind of like, oh, it's just empowerment, it's not working as a program, it's not effective, but as a calculated link to sort of strip these women of a political identity.
Thanks, Nim. I want to actually answer your question without even going into the women's question, if I may, because I think what you're suggesting is that, you know, India is independent, and we are very proud of, you know, our long history of, you know, anti-British, anti-colonial struggle. But do we have the integrity to recognize other nationalities within India? Do we have the openness to say it's possible somebody wants self-determination? Are we even willing to say that without saying, okay, we're not challenging the sovereignty, but are we willing to say that maybe some sections of people want to be identified by their immediate language or national identity, and is Indian the only identity they're allowed to have? So I think that, you know, in that sense, you see, like, you know, there's a massive internet shutdown in Kashmir. We've seen the kind of oppressions, we've seen the mass graves, we've seen, you know, the mass rapes. And then we realized that, no, like, you know, one of the world's greatest examples of non-violent independent struggle would not give any scope to even articulate, to even breathe the idea that perhaps they want some greater freedoms. I'm not even saying any separate nation or state. We're not going there. Even greater freedoms, some autonomy. And I think it's the same, isn't it? Like right now, what is happening, and this is true of the northeast of the country. This is true of Tamil Nadu. This is true of the Punjab. It's true of literally, and it's true of Sri Lanka. Like, Sri Lanka is proud that, you know, it fought the British, it fought whoever colonial power was there. But then within the nation, and I think here it's a little bit tricky, because you want to go back to Lenin in Russia, where he says, you know, he called it a prison house of nationalities. But I think a subcontinent, a nation that is made of a multitude of nations, must just at least understand that, you know, in some sense we are a federation, that in some sense we are an union. That's what the Constitution calls as a union of states. So how much do we anticipate that? So I think this imperialist project working there to control, and to hegemonically control not just your territory, but also to control Sri Lanka, but that's what India does all the time, you know, to be this, you know, local superpower. I think that's one of the questions. And the other thing that's, you know, again, troubling here is, as you again said, it doesn't even have to be the articulation of self-determination or, you know, freedom, but even dissent becomes a terrorist activity, as we have now been saying. And, you know, like, apparently today the court has weighed in and said, when people use the word revolution, how can we be sure that it's bloodless? Because revolution can be bloody. So, and when somebody uses the word revolution, it's possible that it's prima facie a terrorist activity. So this is where we have gone to, like, you know, even I think even like hard left Marxists don't necessarily use revolution to mean something bloody at this point in the 21st century. You want to redistribute power, you want to redistribute wealth, you want, you know, some sort of egalitarianism, you want an overthrow of the system, doesn't have to be bloody. Nobody talks about it, but just, you know, this is the way in which I think there's a huge curtailment of whatever is going on. So it's freedom. Without freedom, I don't know, but it's very interesting to see how, you know, nations who fought against imperialism have become imperialist powers themselves. And not being white, I don't think we get to call them imperialist, you know.
I think we should call anybody imperialist who is involved in imperialism. I'm just, you know, that's just my view on it. I actually want to circle back, Nimmi, for something, and to both of you, actually. And here I'm showing my age. I'm well older than both our speakers. So in 1991, this is going back a long ways, I was straight out of university, and I read a book by a woman by the name of Eileen MacDonald. And the title is very provocative, Shoot the Women First. There might be some people who know this. And there was a series of interviews with various women who were involved in non-state violence, most well-known of them being Leila Khaled from the Palestinian movement. And I was absolutely, even as a 20-something-year-old, I was completely fascinated and baffled. Because even though the word imperial feminism or white feminism did not kind of enter my consciousness at that point, I was really fascinated because this was somebody who was writing and talking to incredible women, absolutely, who lived fascinating lives. And yet the gaze was entirely imperial. So there was the 20-something-year-old me going, surely that's not the question you want to ask. Surely it's not about her family, or it's not about how lovely she is, or children and mothers. And I'm kind of fascinated about the way this, what are the possibilities? I know my answer, but what are some of the other ways of envisioning or conceptualizing the female fighter, which can perhaps come from the global south, and are not part of this imperial project? How would you think of those?
I think that it was actually, this is the reason that I started the Female Fighter series at Gowrinathan magazine, because I was able to see representations of female fighter in the media in particular ways, right? And there's always the juxtaposition of pink manicured nails on an AK-47, right? As if this kind of the feminine, aggressive thing becomes very, very sort of attractive to the liberal imagination. Or it would be the very beautiful pale-skinned Kurdish women, on the front pages with green eyes, right? So there was a racial element to it as well in terms of who got represented, how they got represented. And of course there was the political agenda, right? The US would put forward, or images would emerge that were tied to what the US was supporting, right? So our movements didn't. And part of me thought that, this is, because of your department also, I think a lot about narrative, and about writing, and how, and most recently I'm doing a lot more work on the question of narrative and how it is in itself, of the multiple forms of captivity that I see sort of encircling these women, this narrative scaffolding of the liberal project becomes yet another one that is very, very powerful, and we don't, always grapple with, right? And so the theory was, well, if I could get some, novelists, if I can get others who are from these countries to write about these women in all of their richness, right? Not in these policy reports, and not in these, like, why did this one woman in California join ISIS with what did she call it, the report, Cruel Intentions. And she had a cover of it, this white woman researcher who was 12 years old and did some research on female fighters from ISIS, and she followed one woman in Santa Barbara, and it became this thing that got circulated everywhere, about this woman. And all of these sort of misperceptions that I had seen in the policy world, that I had seen everywhere. Now I've been in conversations with women in the FBI who say, well, we realize that these women are going, from Syria, and they miss their creature comforts, so they come back. And then she says, like, a glass of wine or their favorite sitcom. Are you comparing Syrian refugees to somebody in the West who has a glass of wine and their favorite sitcom? No. So all of these misperceptions, and I was hoping with this series to kind of, with each piece, dismantle one of these narratives of the female fighter. No? And the first was done by my very good friend Valeria Luiselli, and she wrote about the women in the FARC, but she wrote about it through her mother. And her mother had joined Chiapas when she was young, had joined the Zapatistas, and her mother came with me to interview the women in the FARC. And then Valeria reflected on her mother's testimony and what it was to have a mother who was in a revolutionary movement and what that felt like as a daughter, right? So that intergenerational sort of question. We had a very important piece on Boko Haram and the Boko Haram wives, right? What does it mean to become a wife as a political act, right? Not all of them were kidnapped, not all of them joined. Many of them believed in the cause of Boko Haram. And again, this gets very difficult because, that piece in particular was, I had preconceptions, and it was difficult for me because no matter what, you get caught in this kind of condemn or condone violence, right? And that's not a very useful frame. It's not useful, even if you disagree with it. All that matters is that violence is a political reality in the lives of these women, right? And so how they navigate that is what we have to understand. Meena did an incredible series of analysis of poetry from female fighters around the world. And I think what's happening now that's really important, is really exciting, is that female fighters' work themselves is coming out, right? So it's not folks like us who are trying to sort of authentically put their sort of voices into the world, but there are translations, there are new pieces that they are writing, and that's more what we're looking at. And an important piece in that series, too, about black women taking up arms in the United States, because it became very easy for people to say, well, this is out there and this is something in Eritrea, but it's not in the U.S. Of course, black women have taken up arms in the U.S. Of course, they may do it again, right? So a conversation with Kimberly Crenshaw in that series, too. So for me, that became my way of each piece, you know, asking someone to take this preconceived notion and dismantle it, you know, to see a fuller picture of this woman.
I was so lost in listening to Nimmi, I forgot the original question.
The other way of seeing what you've written in here.
Are there other ways to think of the female fighter, other ways to, or a fuller picture, perhaps?
Yes, I think what Nim came to towards the end is, you know, questions of self-representation, like how do they see themselves as opposed to how do we put all of this. And I think part of, you know, trying to find their own voices, because, you know, it's true, of course, the Tigers always claim that a third of their fighting force is female. I think the Maoists claim that 60%, anywhere between 50 and 60% of their fighters are female in India. But then, you know, like you go through archives, you go through like even Maoist own, you know, publications where they have put down the list of all the martyred or all the dead, you know, female fighters. And you find they have like so sketchy biographical information. And not all of the women were allowed to write, but also it's very crazy because you couldn't write under your own name because you were part of a guerrilla movement, so you had to write under surnames or other names, so you couldn't always trace which article goes to whom, who wrote what. So I think that, yeah, that kind of question of, you know, what did the women have to say and were they seen as or taken as intellectuals is very important. And so in putting together this essay or, you know, collection of poems for Guernica, which, you know, the female fighter series, which Nimmi edits, I got to work on the poetry of the female fighters, because I realized that they were not using poetry as something romantic or something to describe, you know, just things. They were using poetry as, you know, the way you would use a manifesto. They were using poetry the way you would use an op-ed, you know, to write into a moment, to also do the political analysis. They were calling it poems, but, you know, I'm just going to read two of them. Ouch. So this one was called, this one is called Superpowers. It's by someone called Captain Kasturi. Superpowers, in order to surge ahead, you torture others. When your power will be probed, it will be clear that developing countries were driven to destitution by you. For you to create a history on the moon, you strip and pillage and shame lands. Your coming only increases poverty and famine. The Red Cross of your land does not gather the wounded. They are not only into inventory. Your country's researchers tabulate the statistics of deaths alongside stocks. Those peace-loving countries who have brokered deals with you have entered our land and only birthed troubles. As your airports expand, is it not our little huts that are set on fire? You tactfully enter peaceful countries, cut their flourishing roots, and pour water on the stalks so that they do not appear dead. Most often, your interventions have left behind only scorched earth. You are the international terrorists going to claim ownership of the artificial hurricanes that you will create. So this was one of those poems. And then there's another one where I think they are very... Huh? Oh, that's from the Tiger. So Captain Kasturi died when she was 22, 23, I think in the battle for Elephant Pass, which was a massive battle in the 90s. This is another poem from another tigress called Captain Vanati. And this is again, you know, like a lot of, you know, for me to situate the Tamil women who joined the Tigers and what were they doing within the Tigers, I think they were not like within the Tigers. They were not just, you know, like trying to go and change this organization, but they were like, this is my organization and I want to, you know, create this feminist space. And so there was like so much of claim over it, but also they had a very clear agenda, very feminist agenda. And so it was obviously, I think a lot of people, like especially, you know, I think generally feminism, Indian feminism, or any broader feminism likes to forego or not look at this angle that, you know, these women might have been, you know, explicitly feminist in that sense. So I'm just going to read a poem. It says, "Get ready for battle. You who have become a refugee in your kitchen because of the storm of patriarchy, you waging a silent war with fire, get ready and come. Let your self-confidence grow and your courage too. Do you have any freedom to act on your thoughts and your desires? Family life does not exist for the have-nots now. This is what has continued into the 20th century. Like the dreams of someone mute, your emotions now run silent. You sob in the kitchen as you're being wrapped. Get ready and come away. Let us create a new era in the shadow of the guns we now carry. When we get national freedom that we desire so deeply, we will build the tomb for women's exploitation. We will dig the graves for society's backward ideas. For this revolution tomorrow, you must come today. Look, there in a flood of blood, your sister holding her gun out to you. Take her weapon, walk in her footsteps." So this is, you know.
Yeah, I think this is probably one of the areas that I find very interesting, that it makes, I think, a lot of self-declared feminists, especially from the global north, but also places, sort of the liberal feminists in places like India, upper caste feminists especially, who I feel are quite analogous. Upper caste feminism in India is very analogous to white feminism in the global north, get very concerned. Yeah, because, you know, the idea of violent overthrow or violent action for feminism is still seen as a bridge too far, and I'm quite fascinated by it, because I think there is increasing evidence that a lot of movements across the global south have had a very clear feminist agenda, especially amongst their own combatants. I think this is also a good moment to sort of now open it up to you. And I think there should be lots of questions. I can keep asking questions, and I don't want to do that. But I'd like to hear from you if there are questions. Louise.
and also to emasculate the Republican men, or how can you be involved in this movement which has all of these crazy, deranged, deluded, dangerous women associated with it? So I just wonder how those gender politics play out. You've mentioned a lot about the Tamil Tigers. Was there a way in which the very high visibility of the women was used to discredit the men and to somehow to emasculate the men by their enemies?
Nim, do you want to take this? I think that there are two answers to this question. The first question is the reason that we do the work we do, or we write what we write, is also for people to make peace with history and to acknowledge it. That you cannot make whatever terrorist acts can exist. We cannot say talking about the Tigers, talking about a history is wrong. And I think for Tamil people to understand, whether you're Indian or Elam Tamil, to understand what the Tigers meant is important. And I think I really felt this very deeply because when the Irish women's football team won, and they sang a song which happened to be an IRA chant, and the way everybody went after them, well, this is their history, you just cannot take away from Irish people, their pride or whatever it is. And this I think that's so much about what's the problem with Britain, is to realize that, I might write in English, but I have a very difficult relationship with, the British's oppressors. You just cannot take away that part of me, even if I use your language. And I think that's something that the empire has really not understood to this day. To this day, I'm very much against the Indian nation, but when my national anthem plays, I cry, because it means something about the British. As much as India is problematic, these are sentiments you cannot take away, and you have to acknowledge that history. So that's the first thing I wanted to say, that all of this history has to be acknowledged instead of to say what they did. And the second thing is the question of emasculation of the man as a way of controlling the women. I think it has been really studied a lot, for instance, in communal violence in India, for instance, like between Hindus and Muslims, especially the way the Hindu right wing has gone after Muslim women and the rape of Muslim women. I'm very not as much aware of the construction of Tamil masculinity and why these rapes were happening, because it was, in a sense, it was that, it was a sense of shaming, because some of the times, and this was happening even afterwards, because I think it was not just the idea of the man, but also some of the raped women I met, the female fighters, the doctors, I was asking, how did you manage, how did you survive all these rapes? And they said that there were doctors in the camp, Tamil doctors, who were constantly putting them on abortion pills to make sure that, after all that they went through, they were not giving birth to children. And but one of the women told me that the soldiers told her, you should carry our children, So this idea that, in some way polluting the blood, or in some way, making the women carry their children, whatever it meant, I think that is also part of the rape project. That is also part of the occupation and the colonization. So of course, it was both. And I also think the nature of violence has changed, because you read these testimonies, we talk about women and rape, but so many Tamil survivors are also Tamil male sexual survivors of violence, isn't it? So it's also I'm going to let Nimmi answer the rest of the question. But yeah.
I'm not sure if you know, but there's a lot of Tamils that named their kids after the IRA as well, on the naming question, that it's a very, very powerful connection between the two. And there is actually a monument to the struggle in Northern Ireland. So it's a very, very strong connection. And I know that the women have worked together, and that there have been, on a separate note, Sonia mentioned something earlier about solidarity. And one of, when I used to come to London and do research, they would be these uncles who would say, we would come here to this Tamil house, and we would sit, and, the Eritreans would be there, Libyans would be there, the IRA would, and we would talk about politics, and someone would feed us, and nobody had any money, and we had political education. Of course, that was a very masculine space. It was always a masculine space. And then they had the conferences for women, right? Even the most recently with the FARC. They had in Cuba, it was women from the FARC, women from Peru, women from the IRA, right? But that was a separate conversation than the political conversation happening in Cuba. I think on the bigger question that you're asking, this is why it's very important to me to reveal the ways in which we depoliticize gender. Because once you've depoliticized gender, it can be weaponized on either side, right, for any political agenda, No, so once you've said Aung San Suu Kyi is this idol of peace because she's a woman and this and that, then you no longer read her politics as a Buddhist nationalist when she asks you to. No? When you have that kind of depoliticizing of women, I think that it's very, very dangerous because you not only don't see women who are, let's say, on the right or who are violent or whatever, but you also, it leaves it open to so many other agendas, right? For their pain to be pulled into these political agendas. There was a gang rape of a woman in northern Sri Lanka after the war, and, you know, we decided, a colleague of mine and I, that they asked us to write about it, and it was like we could write about this gang rape. It was not long after the Delhi horrible bus gang rape. And then we thought, no, we're not going to write about this moment. What we're going to do is we're going to write about the narrative that spun around this poor child's body. You know? She was inside the Tamil community. She was raped by somebody in the Tamil community. So immediately the narrative starts to spin, right? The military says, well, it's chaos up there after the war. We need the military to be there, justifying their agenda for militarization. The Tamil community sort of triggers this patriarchal protective thing that circumscribes a woman, but also starts to argue for, that the contours of a homeland should be around this woman's honor. No, we need a homeland. That's what it's for. The NGOs are in bids for money to do, gender education, but applying this ill-fitting feminist framework, right? Everybody used this child's rape for a particular agenda. No? So I think that at least the Tigers that I've known and the Tamil women that I've known in the past 20 years, not only are they conscious of that, right? I don't think that the state really used the women. They never saw them very seriously. Thamalini, who's one of the captains who died, would say in her book that just came out, as soon as they were in the peace talks, that the soldiers would immediately, or the media would ask, from the other side, how is it with your hair so short? And are you allowed to wear a sari? And can you get married? And so I don't know that they ever fully grappled with the presence of these women, until one of them was probably shot by them. But the Tamil women also understood that, right? And they would manipulate that. And that, to me, is also a big part of my work, is revealing those spaces that we're not looking for women's power, so that these women, some of them would feign being pregnant to go into detention centers and see their husbands and pass information, right? Or there was a woman who was raped, and her husband told her to report the rape in a village, and it was run by this one soldier. She didn't report it because the village was doing very well because he was allowing water into the entire village, right? So that is also a political act, Even doing the research on the women who were raped, there was a church where they were all held. There was a big discussion in the community, how should she go and how should I go in? You could be an NGO worker, you could pretend to be a doctor. In the end, I took my son, he was 6, 7 months old. It's best if you go in as a mother. And I just walked in. Soldiers said nothing, So on both sides, I think there is our recognition at a broader level of how we depoliticize gender, and then it gets weaponized by these various political agendas. And also a recognition that these women saw that, and they use that towards their own political agenda.
Do we have any questions? Yes, please, up front.
I have one, but it might sound a little bit silly. I just really want to know that after these many years, I'm sure that these women were rehabilitated in a certain way. Where are they now and how are they?
Yeah, they were rehabilitated. It was a really sort of difficult, tragic thing dealing with how the NGOs sort of colluded with the government on this rehabilitation process. It was essentially they had to go through, and I've documented a lot of this in the book, that they finish a sewing training, and then they're de-radicalized. Most of them are unemployed. It's very difficult to get work. If they know you're an ex-combatant, their only options for employment, it's now military-occupied territory, so everything is run by the military. So the vegetable shops, the hotels, everything is run by the military. So imagine that you've been, at war with these guys, and you have to pass them to go to the vegetable shop, right? And the military guys will say, like, we know what Tamils eat for lunch. That's how intense the surveillance is, right? So now we're, 12 years out, and they have to go report every week. And still, the women I met last time I was there will say if they come back, we'll join again. I'll absolutely join again. They're trying to start political parties. They're trying to engage in some of this work. Some of them have taken a lot of the ex-combatants and started their own businesses, like tea business, because they're very good at the jungle, because they understood it. They were living the jungle doing that work. So they can pull like where the best teas are from there, where the resources are. So they've done a lot of that outside of the state. That's one of the more positive things, I think. I do think there's a lot of political innovation. I do see the next generation doing a lot of sort of graphic art to describe their work. Last time we were there, we asked, we'll give a talk on anything. What is it that you guys want? And we want to talk on research methodology, which is like the world's dullest subject, no? But that's what they wanted, and 250 women came into this tiny room in Jaffna with headphones to translate things, whatever, to learn how to, in a way that would be understood outside of Sri Lanka, document the violence and record it and put it forward. No?
I'm going to quickly answer the question on rehabilitation. I think rehabilitation, not just of the Tigers, but of any armed combatant, because I'm speaking of the Maoist India, is actually a project of extended surveillance. So you stop being a combatant, but like the Tigers, the women told me they were given a phone and they had to be with this phone all the time. These women said, I'd throw it in the well or I'd take the SIM card out, but this was how they were tracked. This was how people making calls to them were tracked, so that they have, any remnants of the movement can exist. But also once a woman is rehabilitated, or even a male combatant is rehabilitated, or surrendered, or whatever they call it, de-radicalized, then they become suspect. So whatever remains of the former militant movement exist, like even your own brothers, your own sisters, your own family, think that you have access to the military, think you have access to the state, or think that this information can be pulled out of you by the state, so they don't trust you. So what you gain in terms of, you don't gain anything at all, because you're distrusted now, both by the state, which sees you as an ex-combatant, and by the combatants who see you as an informer. So I think this entire thing is very important in the Maoist movement in India, but also I think among the Tigers as well. So it just divides family against family, breeds paranoia, and it's like, its own kind of inner version of hell, I think. So.
Yeah, I think I'm going to just pitch in a little bit there and just say that I'm not sure. I think any kind of de-radicalization program or rehabilitation program or is extended surveillance. It's extended state surveillance, but also I'm not sure if any project that depoliticizes what our political grievance is going to function for anyone except the state, and other stakeholders in quotes, but anybody. It will not work for the people who are most impacted, I think, and I think that's something that's become very clear across multiple moments and movements.
Again, and the specific thing I should mention for the Tigers is the cyanide pill. No? So they all wore the cyanide pill, and the movement had a very strong sort of belief in the martyrdom, aspect of this, and that if they were taken by the army, they were supposed to take the cyanide pill. So even the woman leader, Damlani, who was in jail, when she was taken, she whispered to some doctors that I knew on the outside, please tell everybody I didn't have the cyanide pill. No? Because the community would have judged her for being captured, right, for not taking that cyanide pill. And again, I think to go back to some of the writing, this is where I turned to nonfiction writing from the policy world, existing in the policy world, but writing through nonfiction about it because of this conference on de-radicalization that took place in a very weird monastery in Italy for security reasons. And this basement of this church in Italy gathered all these counter-terror experts, right? I don't know why they invited me, I have no idea. They probably needed a diverse space or some such thing, But in that conference, I heard the most absurd things that I have ever heard, because it begins with why you didn't see her in the first place, right? And those reasons are where you come up with your solutions from. No? So this is like the heads of counterterror of Israel, of Turkey, of whatever, right? In these conversations, reasoning like, well, and you had a butcher paper, now everybody had to come up with solutions to women's radicalization. And none of them had met a female fighter. None. No? I mean, the guy from Romania is saying, I go to Disneyland and they search me and they search my wife in Paris. They don't search my 4-year-old daughter. Why we don't search 4-year-old daughters? And I was like, and I guess because, that kind of militarization leads to sexual violence and also not a great solution, no? And in thinking about writing this as a nonfiction, and this is where there was a counterterror expert who said, well, we found that women are drawn to ISIS by these, Tumblr images of Arabic men on horses and long flowing hair, no? They did a Tumblr survey. No, these are academics, no? And pastel colors. One should be really careful of pastel colors because they radicalize, And in trying to write about this in a serious way and to say, like, this is what I think that's wrong with counterterror and radicalization and whatever, I couldn't do it because it was so absurd. So I ended up writing this essay that's in Guernica called The Bride of Frankenstein, because I was able to write it only in a way that was, you've created the monster that you're now trying to take apart. And then I was able to, I watched the movie 2 or 3 times, and I was able to go in and sort of reveal the absurdity through the conceit of the piece, right? They've now taken out her brain with, all exactly what they said. It was all documented. It was all true, right? But to me, that was much more powerful politically to be able to show it that way, to reveal the absurdity, than just to say, this is why you're all really, really racist.
And Nim is like possibly my best friend, but I have to disagree. I think that women are drawn to handsome fighters. I used to crush on Puttu Maniltiti, so we used to have, posters of younger Prabhakaran. So I think
Daniel Ortega. I know. Bad news. There we go. We're all going to, share our strange, odd crushes here now. Yes, of course.
Yeah, I want to make a comment first, because only because of what you've just said. It's sorry, the middle of the thing, Doctor. When Black Lives Matter erupted over here, now I'm not talking about the organisation, I meant the riots over here, and when the schools went back, it was like lockdown, I was told on Facebook of a white person going into a school, and the school where her daughter went to, she was the only black girl in the class, and it was a group of 2 white women doing this workshop, and when they presented the workshop about understanding black people, I can't remember what it was called, although it was just race and racism, and they never once asked the black girl to give an example to back up anything they were saying. They never once said to her, and she just like, she's a good pupil, so she just sat there and just took it, never really questioned her either. But it's just interesting what you said about that rehabilitation. So what I just wanted to ask you both was, have you ever been in dangerous situation? Well, maybe all 3 of you, because I can't remember what you do. Been in
I think
dangerous
Sunny more than all of
situations.
us put together.
No, in situations with your work, but also going thinking, this is maybe going off point. I've recently heard in the news about what's happened with President Modi, and I don't really understand. Is that connected with? I mean, maybe it's not for this talk. I can understand that.
With the Prime Minister, yeah, I think.
I've heard that a lot from women there, or different of what's considered lower caste have been raped and the sexual violence.
I think there's quite a lot. Yeah, not at all. Thank you for the question. I think I'm going to pass it to, because I think there's multiple things. There is the state. There is a right-wing party at the moment currently in power, democratically elected. We can, so there's multiple. I think I like Nimmi's description of concentric circles. There are multiple circles at play, and part of that is also sexual violence used as in various ways by various parties. So I think I'm going to pass it on if you want to add anything to it, but that's where I would leave it.
Recently, yeah, this is quite an interesting question. Have we been in places of danger? I think, you see, there's danger for the kind of work you do. Like, for instance, after the genocide, they cannot say somebody supports the Tigers, even though they have the Indian state is making that argument. But earlier, I used to work from Tamil Nadu for a slightly sympathetic website, and the danger that they would come and swoop me up and say that you work for Tamil Nadu, it existed, but it was not something that prevented me from doing the work I was doing, because still somebody had to do this. But I think recently I witnessed something much more firsthand, which is like going to this conflict zone in Bastar. I've written, Nimmi edits a magazine called ADI, ADI, ADI magazine. So it's going to come sometime in December, I guess. But I wrote this long essay of visiting central India, which is a conflict zone. The area is the territory is held by the Maoists. So the Indian government has a lot of army camps there. And so there's a small village called Selgair, which has no electricity, no running water, no toilets, no school, no hospital in a 17-kilometer radius. And the army wanted to build a camp there. And the people decided that, they're going to occupy or sit in protest at the site of the camp so that the camp is not built. And there was a police firing that killed 4 people. So for an entire year, they have been occupying this place, not moving. And so tribal people or Adivasi people from other villages come and occupy this space so that there's continuous occupation, and then the army cannot, make inroads into this, build this camp. But it was very interesting because, like once we went to, right from Dantewada where the Red Corridor starts, you're under surveillance. So they tell you stuff like, don't even close the windows of your car, because if you close the windows of your car, the army could get suspicious and shoot you. So once you go into the, into the zone, you're supposed to keep your things, your windows down. And then we are completely like, we have all our IDs taken at a checkpoint, and then they send it to their superiors. Like, and we were like, not even, I was going as a writer, so, so literally every officer knows who is entering this zone. And then they stopped us. We had to go past at least 36, 37 checkpoints. And then they stopped us at one of these and said that, if you are going, we cannot guarantee your life. Like, the Maoists could kill you, so why do you want to go? We were like, we still want to see what's happening, so we can't guarantee your life. But then, we had to fight, we had to meet the collector, we had to say that, we are going to sit right here and start a protest if you don't let us go. But all these times you realize that, it would be so easy for them just to say you are trying to help a terrorist or trying to help the Maoist and put you in jail. So you are totally, absolutely in their hands, So until you go there and then come back. And then once we were in this village, my friends were saying they made all arrangements. And then I think there was something very interesting. Just before I left, somebody, I met this random, group of people with whom we were traveling. Somebody came and gave me malaria pills. And they said, you take one today, you take one tomorrow, then you take one after 4-hour gaps. And then I took the pills and I realized we have the blessings of the Maoists, because only somebody who lives in the jungle would give us malaria medication before we went there. This was not like, just newsrooms are not going to take care of us the same way as the rebels would, So I think, there was no point of contact except, of course, malaria pills, because a lot of deaths in central India do happen. So you do see, the same ways in which the state invisibilizes and is visible, I think the rebel movements are also visible and invisible at the same time. And then we had to, they said every arrangement is made. So it was a long journey. We went and we were sleeping on these tarpaulin sheets under the tree. There was literally no shelter. And I was like, should I be worried about tigers or lions or wild animals or the army? Like, it's literally like no man's land. And, it's, but then at the same time, I think there's an enormous code of respect that people have towards rebels, like, I would know that if I went to a tiger territory or a Maoist territory, I don't think I would be raped by a Maoist, like, in a territory by an actual fighter. I don't know what made them gain that integrity, but I never had that fear like when I was there. But then later on I came back and I thought, we're just sleeping under the blue tarpaulin sheets, like what if things went bad? But yeah, I do think that kind of moment. But I think the chances of being raped by the army, I think far outweigh anything sinister by the rebels itself. So
I think on picking up on that, and before I pass it to Nimmi, I think my experience is that people who are marginalized, even if they have taken up weapons, are so desperate to get their stories out that they are unlikely to be the people perpetrating the violence. Having said that, I think there is a very vast range of people. There are some groups that I would not necessarily go towards or want to cover at any point. But I think the ones we've been talking about have. I think there's also something to be thought about. There is an enormous amount of work, generally groups, militant groups that have a strong feminist egalitarian worldview. I don't want to necessarily kind of put it in terms of Western political ideologies, tend to have less in-group violence towards women, but they also tend to then be safer when women who may not belong to the group are traveling through their territories. And I know that's a really vast generalization, and I would want to be very careful regardless for specifics, but that tends to be the case.
No, I'd only add that, we were asked yesterday, I was asked by some first-year human rights students at UCL, like, you're in danger. And, the bigger answer to that is that there has to be first a reckoning with privilege. So as a U.S. citizen entering into these areas, I did have that protection. The Sri Lankan government was never quite ready to go up against the West in that way. But I do think when it comes to sexual violence, it's a very different thing, right? That is the one area I'm particularly talking to mostly women about to enter this field, that it was important to reveal that will always be, a very real danger. And they were sort of asking, when you're with an NGO, an international NGO, and you're with UN and, all these other places, is there a higher power, a higher safe space to protect you if something goes wrong? And for me, that safe space has to be, there has to be an acceptance, And none of us were ever trusted inside the UN or the NGOs. We worked for them, but they would not have been there. They definitely hung us out to dry in Afghanistan and other places, right? The protection comes from the ground. It comes from the community, for sure. But there certainly were moments, where you are like documenting all these women raped in this hostel by the military, and then you're staying in this hostel, and then all the military at a bar downstairs, and you're like, fuck, I just recreated a moment that was here, a year before. And I will also say, and it comes to me mostly through Meena and her work, is that I do think things have changed now than when I started my work some time ago. I think we're facing increasingly brazen states. And I think that that's a real thing that has to be considered and discussed. And I use that word on purpose, because of its gendered sort of connotations. But these are emboldened regimes, right, that will shoot a female journalist, at point blank range, that will, brag about sexual assaults, that will, all with a real sense of complete impunity, right? And I think that these guys have gotten very good at weaponizing things like the Me Too movement, right? I think that, they've had all these women who are irritating them fighting for land rights and caste rights and war crimes in Kenya, right? And then they say something about, in this Me Too moment, right, about sexual violence, usually on the left, right, not one of them. And then the governments can very happily sort of wield that cultural backlash that crosses political lines to actually force them into exile. And I've seen that happen over and over and over again. So I do think we're in a different moment. I think, it is much more dangerous to do this work.
Do we have any more questions, or shall we start wrapping up? Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, I'm going to. Yes, we will be here for a bit, so you can always come up and have a chat if you don't want to have a question put out openly. But thank you very much to Nimmi and to Meena, and thank you all for coming out.
Thank you, Sunny, for organising it. It was absolutely great. I hope you'll put something for us on the website about it. I took a photograph.